Thank you for being here. I have really tried to cram probably too much into this session, so I'm going to do my best to cover what I can. But if there are questions, you don't have to wait till the end. You can raise your hand. If we don't cover it all, we don't cover it all. You'll get the slides. But this is kind of a lot of information, but just wanted to, talk to you guys today about, how to make your libraries as neurodiverse affirming as possible. So it's effective interactions, creating welcoming spaces, and collaborating with community partners. So, I've already gotten this nice introduction here, but what we're going to talk about today is just how do you understand neurodiversity and the needs of neurodiverse patrons, enhance communication and interaction with neurodiverse individuals, create accessible, inclusive library spaces and programs, and build community partnerships to support and promote neurodiversity. Like I said, it's a lot. So we'll just start out, we talk about neurodiversity. I think people know more about that term now than maybe 3 to 5 years ago, but there's still a little bit of misunderstanding about what does that mean. So neurodiversity, as you see here, is just a concept where neurological differences are to be recognized and respected as any other human variation. So that's kind of what we're talking about when we say neurodiversity. So there isn't really like a normal, or when it comes to the human brain and how people perceive the world around them. So if there are differences, those differences are good, and we want to make sure that we serve everybody that comes to our library the best we can. So some terminology here. Neurodivergent, like we mentioned, is a person whose brain just performs differently than whatever society considers to be the norm. So like I mentioned, there isn't a normal, but society still puts that out there as this is what the majority of people are. And so what we consider to be neurotypical. So neurotypical is just the opposite, somebody who has more typical neurological or development or functioning. A newer term that you may have heard of or may not have is neurominority. I don't know if you've heard of that term before, but this is kind of just a group of people whose brain functions or neurological traits differ significantly from the majority. So that leads to experiences of prejudice and discrimination potentially. So it may be that if you feel like you have a diagnosis of ADHD. Maybe you feel like you fall within that neurominority, and there are certain stereotypes that are applied to you or discriminations that are applied to you. So in that case, you would be considered a neurominority. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, we're really looking at a medical model versus a social model. So it's a way of just perceiving neurodiversity. There's two different kind of perspectives there. So with the medical model, so me being trained as a clinical psychologist, it did come more from that medical model perspective. So doing an assessment, trying to figure out what are the deficits, what are the impairments, using terms like disease or disorder, that would be considered part of that medical model, wanting to cure or fix whatever that is, and focusing more on what is wrong with the person. And that's changed as well. Like in psychology, the way people are trained now, it is different, but it is still considered, a diagnosis, a label. The social model is more what neurodiversity, that movement has been based on. So what is the problem with how society is set up so that we're pathologizing the person? So because the environment's not accommodating for everybody, that doesn't mean that somebody has something wrong with them. There's something wrong with how society is set up and what we need to do to accommodate more individuals and more differences. And what can society do to take away barriers and to accommodate the person? And how can we embrace the benefits of neurodiversity? So there's a lot of strengths that we'll see that go along with this. And so how can we kind of not penalize people for those differences, but rather embrace them? The medical model still does have some benefit in terms of, unfortunately, to get accommodations, say in a school setting or a work setting, you have to have a diagnosis, so there's still that functionality there. It can still be helpful in terms of if somebody does need treatment for something, being able to identify, where they can get some support and some help. So there's still some benefit to that medical model. But in libraries, we're really focusing more on the social model, and neurodiversity, that movement is based more on the social model perspective. So neuroaffirming practices. So that would, like we just talked about, taking a strength-based approach. What are the individual's strengths? What can they do? Using neurodiversity friendly language. And so this may be something as simple as not using terms like normal or abnormal, or even high or low functioning. So those terms are things that probably would be helpful to avoid. There is some debate about person first language versus identity first language. So person first is something that's often promoted as saying a person with autism or a person with ADHD. However, in the neurodiverse community, often identity first language is preferred. That is a part of who they are. It's part of their identity. And so saying an autistic person. So it's not no one right answer for everybody. And so if you are comfortable and know the person, asking what they prefer can be helpful. It also depends on context. If you are more in a medical, clinical situation, it might be more person first as opposed to in a community setting or an advocacy organization where it'd be more identity first. But just like we all try to do, practice empathy and respect, So if somebody is having some difficulty with whether it's an employee or a person visiting the library, maybe trying to see it from their perspective. Maybe things are not clear, it's too bright, it's too loud, it's whatever. So just being able to understand that people are going to experience the library differently and showing respect for what they need and some empathy for how they're experiencing the world. And looking to change systems and the environment rather than asking the person to adjust or to adapt. So those would all be neuroaffirming practices. So when we're talking about neurodiversity, there's lots of different areas that somebody may have differences in. And so somebody may have differences in all of these areas, just one or two, it just depends. So these are some of the key areas that you might see differences in. So sensory regulation, I think a lot of people now are very used to hearing things like having sensory issues or, I can't think of the term now, but, having problems with sensory. So things, lights, sounds, textures, a lot of people are more aware of that now, but some people may be more bothered by it than others. So they might be hyporeactive or hyperreactive to sensory. Executive functioning, that's that think, stop, plan. So somebody, it's not just somebody's IQ level, but can they stop? Can they think? Can they not do something impulsively? How is that person able to plan and organize can be a difference that somebody has with neurodiversity. Communication, so the back and forth communication can be a challenge for some people or a difference in what they prefer. Socialization, emotional regulation. So, if you have a patron who's neurodiverse, you may see emotions are harder to regulate with them. So they may be more upset by something than another patron, or they may, just have a harder time regulating themselves if they're excited, that kind of thing. So, so just differences in these areas. These are all things that could go along with neurodiversity. And then these are some, we'll talk about several of these, but some of the more common diagnoses. If somebody, to have a diagnosis, you have to have an impairment. So somebody can be neurodiverse and not have a diagnosis. So if they're functioning fine at home, school, work, in the community, they're neurodiverse, but they don't have a diagnosis. These are all just some diagnoses that may go along if it's to the point where somebody is impaired in their functioning. So there's autism spectrum disorder, dyspraxia, Tourette's, dyslexia, dyscalculia, ADHD. These are all terms that we're probably all pretty familiar with and that we've seen, and we'll talk about some of these. Some people go more broadly with neurodiversity. They may see, like I've thought of it, sensory processing disorder. So that could fall within neurodiversity. OCD or depression or anxiety could potentially be considered a neurodiversity. So that's still something that people haven't really decided, like how broad or how narrow is that term. But in general, talking about neurodiversity, it's often something neurodevelopmental, something that starts from the get-go when somebody's born. Usually it's from birth to cradle kind of condition, although some, like ADHD, individuals can outgrow that as their brain continues to develop and grow as they get older. But, these are usually neurodevelopmental in nature. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these things here. So just talking about what are they? what are the strengths, what are the differences, and what can we do in libraries to support these particular diagnoses. And so I think we're all familiar, with autism spectrum at this point. So there used to be a diagnosis called Asperger's disorder. That is actually not a diagnostic category. Oh, I keep doing that. So sorry. But that is not a diagnostic category anymore. They kind of took that away. So if somebody had that diagnosis, they now fit into the autism spectrum diagnosis. So, and it can be a range. But again, with this being a disorder, it means that somebody does have some kind of impairment in their functioning. And so a neurodevelopmental disorder characterized by difficulties with social communication and social interaction and restricted and repetitive patterns in behaviors, interests, and activities. So that's the definition from the American Psychological Association. So some quick facts. If you're at a public library, school library, academic, most likely you're going to have patrons and coworkers that may be on the autism spectrum. So it's 1 in 36 children, 1 in 45 adults. Boys are diagnosed at 4 times the rate of girls. There's still some debate about why that is. It could be how the diagnostic criteria is written. It could be lots of things. It's unclear of whether it's a gender issue or a diagnostic issue. All ethnic and socioeconomic groups fall into this category, and it's one of the fastest growing developmental disorders. So this is something that all of us will encounter. So some key features of autism spectrum disorder, like we mentioned, are the social communication challenges. So this would be things like having a back and forth conversation, the person knowing how to initiate or how to stop an interaction, physical boundaries, all of those things fall into social communication challenges. Also, things like just, forming same-age friendships can be a challenge. Restricted and repetitive behavior. So this can also be, like we said, the sensory type of concerns, as well as maybe somebody who's very routine, has to be done in a certain way at a certain time, really stuck on certain topics and want to talk about certain things all the time. So that could fall in that category as well. There's also executive functioning challenges. And I think it's important to note that, of the people that are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, only a third would be considered below average IQ. So the majority of individuals with a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder do not have cognitive limitations. So it's important, although they may need supports, they are just as functioning, and just the IQ is average to above average for most people that have that diagnosis. So keeping that in mind. And the sensory integration difficulties. So these are all things that somebody with this diagnosis may have, and some may be more so in some areas than others, but it's typically a combination of these lead to that diagnosis. So the strengths, though, somebody who is on the autism spectrum, is that unique view of the world. Very straightforward. A lot of times it's hard to get a clear answer out of somebody, but somebody on the autism spectrum will often just tell you what they're thinking. Persistence, and these sound like stereotypes. It's not everybody who's on the autism spectrum, but these are some of the things that people that are on the autism spectrum may have traits of. So persistence, very detail-oriented, that deep focus, and tenacity, just sticking with something. So those are all strengths that could go along with autism spectrum disorder, and that thriving on routine. Some of the supports that these individuals may need would be atypical eye contact. So you may have other patrons or colleagues in your office that have a hard time with that. They may think they're staring at them or not making eye contact, but this could be part of the social communication difficulties for that individual. There could be loud or unexpected speech volume, difficulty with personal space. That can be something that could be a challenge. Although it's nice that somebody on the spectrum might be very straightforward, it can come across as being overly direct or unfiltered. So repetitive sounds or self-stimulating behavior stimming, that can sometimes be disturbing to others that are trying to use the environment, the library. Trouble reading social cues and nonverbal signals, and just lower frustration tolerance. And again, these are somewhat stereotyped, but could be potential differences that we'd see with somebody on the autism spectrum. So for us, we're all here from different library types, I'm thinking. So public libraries, academic libraries, what are some tips, for interacting with the patron on the spectrum? So, or a colleague. So it could be setting expectations. So if you kind of let the person know what you're doing, what's next, and why, that can help the interaction. So if you're trying to help somebody in a reference session or checking out a book and you notice that the frustration level's rising for whatever reason, just letting that person know, what you're doing, and, they're not going to be here all day. We're going to do this and this, and then we're done, So just kind of letting them know what's happening. Being clear, so just using direct language, trying to avoid sarcasm, figures of speech that may be hard for the individual to determine what you're trying to tell them. So just being as clear and direct in your language as possible. And then support processing. So for autism spectrum disorder, there is sometimes a challenge with processing speed. And again, we mentioned IQ is not really the issue, but for whatever reason, it can take longer to process and take in what's going on around them, what you're telling them. So if there is, say, for instance, a behavioral issue or concern, just giving the person time to respond, or if they're maybe you're in a reference session and you're not quite sure how that's going, just giving them time to take in what you're telling them. And then you can repeat or clarify if you need to. You can also use just simple communication aids. So trying not to relying on gestures. You can use gestures, but if you're relying on that to communicate, that would be a challenge. Visuals are always helpful. And asking closed-ended questions. We're always trained to ask open-ended questions, but for somebody on the spectrum, that's maybe not enough structure for them. They're not quite clear on what it is you want them to tell you. So using closed-ended questions can help structure that interaction for them. I've had clients in the past that they're verbal and their IQ is fine, but they have a really hard time telling me what they want to tell me. And so they'll just pull out their cell phone and just show me, and so just even having, an iPad or some basic, visuals that people can point at, that can be helpful. Respecting boundaries. So avoiding physical touch is something that would be helpful. Just that may be something the person doesn't understand in terms of the social communication, like, why are you touching me? What does that mean? Or sensory. It may not feel good to them, so it could be a sensory issue. And also just if somebody is having a hard time regulating, giving them a place away from the public area where they can have a minute to regulate themselves. For a lot of libraries, they're trying sensory rooms. That's great. But if you don't have the space, that's okay too. If it's just maybe a table that's off to the side or a little area where the person can just go regulate and then come back and keep enjoying the library, that's helpful. That could also be helpful for younger children. Maybe their caregivers there with them and they're going to leave the library because their child's getting dysregulated. If you can just offer a space where they can have a minute to regulate, then they don't have to leave. They can keep, be at the library, enjoy the library. So that's a way of helping be neuroaffirming in your library. And then promoting autonomy. So this way, most people want to be able to just use the library without having to ask for help. We're always there, we're ready to help, but we don't want people to have to ask for help. So that's where concepts of universal design come in, trying to create the environment that's accessible as possible. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But, there's ways the person can navigate the library through signage and different features where they have some choices. And also, if there's an issue, if somebody is engaging in a behavior that you have to address, giving them some choices of what they want to do, instead of just stop doing that or can't do that here, what are some options, for them and giving them a say. The next thing we'll talk about just quickly is ADHD. This is also a form of neurodiversity. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder that results in a persistent pattern of inattention and or hyperactivity, impulsivity that interferes with functioning or development. So sometimes people think the diagnosis ADHD means you have inattentiveness or hyperactivity, but you can have either or, you can have both. So that diagnosis applies either way. So it's a blanket diagnosis, but it can affect, that ability to pay attention as well as to control impulses. And some quick facts here. This is 11% of children, so it's not surprising a lot of our children may have that diagnosis. Not everybody outgrows it. 6% of adults have ADHD, so it's not guaranteed that a child will eventually outgrow the diagnosis. Again, boys more likely to be diagnosed than girls. Comorbidity. So in this case, comorbidity means you have more than one diagnosis. You have a couple of things going on. So 6 out of 10 individuals diagnosed with ADHD have at least one other mental, emotional, or behavioral disorder. So in my practice, typically we would see if a child had ADHD, a lot of times they also had something called oppositional defiant disorder or anxiety. So often those things go hand in hand. So it makes it a little more complicated. So we're not just dealing with somebody with ADHD, but they may have some other things that go along with that as well. But there's strengths. So with ADHD, the strengths are, again, sounds a little stereotyped, but creativity is definitely there. That problem solving, being able to think about things differently, may come up with a different solution. Multitasking is a strength, as well as hyperfocus. So I've had parents tell me, I don't think my child has ADHD because they can play this video game for hours. And I'll say, well, can they stop playing the game? Oh, no, they get really mad if I tell them to stop. Because they can't break the attention. It's just they cannot move the attention from one thing to another. So that's really more the issue than can't pay attention to anything. It's just things that are not stimulating to them. It's harder for them to sustain attention to, but it's also hard to break the attention. So that could be an issue as well. Being energetic is a nice way of saying less hyperactive, enthusiastic, and adventurous. So these are all things we don't want to snuff this out of people. This is a good thing, and big picture thinking. But there could be some support needs that we need to be aware of if we have ADHD visitors to our library. So again, difficulty focusing or following directions. So you may see this. You may still see this if you work in an academic library, and maybe some of your student workers may have ADHD still. And so then may be hard for them to follow through. Like I told you to do this, and maybe they didn't do that. And so rather than considering that the person's just not listening to you or choosing not to do it, maybe they just really didn't take that in the first place. Or if you're doing a reference session or trying to help somebody at the desk, if they're not sticking with you on this. Trouble with organization and memory. So being able to take a project and break it down into steps, being able to hold on to information in the short-term memory, those can all be things that are impaired. Being restless, needing to move a lot. What may seem like excessive talking. So being able to, the person might interrupt another person that you're trying to help, or maybe talking in an area where they're not really supposed to be talking in the library. It's hard for them to not do that. The impulsivity, turn taking, that can be challenging. So in terms of what we can do as librarians, in terms of our interaction, is kind of opposite an autism spectrum disorder. We're not trying to force people to make eye contact with us. But with ADHD, if you feel like, it's hard for you to know. Somebody they don't tell you. It's an invisible disability. They have to tell you. But if you're picking up on that, eye contact's important to make sure that, did you hear me? Have me, maybe even repeat back what you said if it's something important. Clear, brief instructions are important. Repeating back to you, what was it that you said? If it's something that's written, like you're giving them something to take away from a reference session, maybe you can highlight it for them, mark it, some way of emphasizing if it's written, what's important to pay attention to. One-on-one interactions are probably more helpful than trying to work in a group. So this is where if you're having an instruction session, there may be some students that would be more helpful for them to come see you one-on-one. They may get lost in an instruction session. Helping them break tasks down into steps. So again, a reference session would be a great example, or even just how do I find XYZ in the catalog, showing them, breaking that down into steps. And then supporting with visuals or cues like that can be helpful as well. So a cue would be like, a listening ball or something like that in a story time with children that are having a hard time paying attention and staying focused. And then we have learning disorders. So this is neurodevelopmental disorders that are typically diagnosed in early school-age children, but may not be recognized until adulthood. So you can be all the way into adulthood and never know that you had a math disorder or a reading disorder, characterized by persistent impairment in at least one of three major areas: reading, written expression, and or math. So this is somebody who's functioning, significantly below what you would expect for their age, for their IQ level. And so they're just not able to achieve, and somebody can have it in all. I've had people have diagnosed that had learning disabilities in every single one of these areas. More typically, it's one thing, it's math, it's reading. But it is 15% of school-age children. Of those children, 80% it's reading. So of course we're all about literacy, so how can we, make being around books and literacy something that's fun and not so challenging, and understanding that not everybody's going to naturally, they may want to, but, literacy may not come easy for them. And so what can we do to provide different modalities, what have you? And 20% of the population overall has dyslexia. It's a lot. Yeah, it's a lot of people. Yeah. And it's equal in males and females. This is one of the things that is equally present. But there's still strengths that go along with this. You would think, my goodness, what? So persistence, somebody who has a learning disability, it's really hard and they have to keep pushing themselves. You think of 12 years at the minimum, to get a high school diploma of doing something that is really challenging. It could be embarrassing, if you're not doing as well as your peers, but just being able to keep showing up and keep trying, especially our students that get to the college level. And the work level goes up, the emphasis on independence goes up. So what can they really develop those skills to be persistent, even though it's really challenging. Setting and pursuing goals. So I think we all know there's such a thing as an individualized education plan, a 504 plan. So children that have this diagnosis have been identified. They often have very detailed plans that their educators follow with them. And so they are familiar with, okay, here's my benchmark, here's what I need to do. Okay, now I have this goal. So it's something they learn pretty early on about setting and pursuing goals. They have to use their support networks, even if they don't want to, it's something that they need. They have their teachers, they have their parents, they have, maybe they have a speech therapist or an occupational therapist, who knows? So, using those support networks is something that they learn to do early on. A lot of times, the individuals do have talents and things that you don't measure at school, things like sports or music or technology, taking things apart, putting things back together. Those are all things that may not be measured or graded in the school setting, but they can be very good at those things. And then the strong visual or hands-on learning skills can be present. So what are the support needs? So what we can do is helping with things like time management and fluency. So those are things not necessarily we can help with, but this is a support need. So time management and fluency. So we may be able to teach them some ways of getting what their information needs or using the library in a way that's more efficient for them. Hard time recalling facts and comprehending information. So they may be able to, they can read it, but they couldn't tell you what it meant, that kind of thing. Or they can crunch through numbers, some basic calculations, but couldn't explain how would you apply that. Trouble following directions and completing tasks. Could be some challenges in articulating their thoughts, whether it's in speech or writing. And of course, if you're faced with all this, you would develop probably low self-esteem, low confidence over time can be a challenge for these individuals. So in the library, what we can do is try to use jargon-free language, so being as, just as, just trying to be as clear as we can and not using a lot of terms we learned in library school would be helpful for them, like a database. They may not know what a database is. So those terms that we just kind of use all the time, try to think of another way of putting that. Having supports, again, visuals are very helpful, as are assistive tools like text to speech can be helpful, or speech to text, either way. And so something people, like I said, they can point to a visual, having those kind of tools for individuals to use in your library. Matching their pace and allowing for processing time. So if you're trying to tell the person a lot at one point in time, making sure it's better to do less and have them come back another time and do a little bit more. If you're losing them and they're just not able to process everything you're telling them in that moment. And then just confirm that the person understands. And so just checking in with them as you're going through steps, and they may be fine and they may not. So just kind of making sure that they're keeping up with what it is you're trying to convey. If you are using gestures, just making sure your gestures and your body language are aligning with your message, so it's all clear. And if you use written materials, there is something called Easy Read. It's a way of, you can Google it, but I don't know if anybody here is familiar with that, but it's, it has to do with spacing, the fonts you use, just using visuals and symbols to take the place of text. So just making it so that you can take in something that's high text in an easier way. So thinking about those type of formats. And then with library spaces, and I know this is a lot, but library spaces, there's things we can do here too. So, universal design, I mentioned that. So I think we've all heard of universal design for education and just universal design in buildings. So it started as an architectural term, but it's just really just trying, in terms of libraries, designing our spaces and services so they're accessible and welcoming for people with a broad range of abilities, disabilities, and other characteristics, including age, learning style, language, and culture. And that sounds like a big order. That's a lot. We're trying to be everything to everybody. But it's just a matter of thinking about, as you're designing things, what is going to be able to be used by the majority of your visitors. And so to have a neurodiverse friendly library space, like we mentioned, would be things like signage. We all struggle with signage. I don't think I've ever done this talk with a group that didn't say they hated their signage. So it's just hard. It's one of those things. But, think about things like visuals. What colors are you using? Color cues to let people know this is a quiet area, this is a active area, this is whatever. So you can use color to convey things instead of just text. Thinking about that easy read type of font when you're making your signs. This is another one. It just depends what library you're at, how comfortable you are. If you feel like you can do this, is putting up staff photos and names so that somebody knows that you actually work there, they can come up to you. Some people don't feel comfortable. I've done this with library systems and, where they've had some threats to the staff from visitors. And so, this is not a must do, but if you feel like this would be safe to do and effective, it's again just making it so that the person knows. Not everybody's going to know that you work at the library, even if you have a name tag on. They just have to see that, yes, you really do work here. I can really ask you something that can be helpful. If you can, offer either like a calm space or a sensory room with tools like headphones, weighted black pads, those kind of things. It doesn't have to be super fancy. I've had people say that they just had like a back area of the library where they could put up like a privacy screen. I mean, that wasn't ideal, but it still was a separate space that somebody could go to and regulate if they needed to. If you have a grant or you have money to make a sensory room, that's all the better. And your technology. So if you can equip your computers with screen readers, dictation software, and again, we're talking about neurodiversity generally. So again, it could be somebody who has, some type of difficulty with reading or those kind of things. So just having that technology on your computers can be helpful for lots of different forms of neurodiversity. Flexible lighting, if you, hopefully you don't still have the fluorescence, but if you do, trying to move to LEDs, making it dimmable, having lamps. So just ways that people can have some control over the lighting in their area. And then, just different spaces to support different learning and sensory needs. So I know like in academic libraries, there's been this big push towards learning commons. And so that was the whole thing about having group spaces and, a big open thing and everybody's talking and it's, but now we realize that's not for everybody. So some people still really want to be in a room by themselves. Some people want to be in a group room. Some people want technology. Some people don't. So just different types of sensory needs. So you may have rooms with different types of seating options and just kind of varying your spaces. There's also something with children called parallel play, where they, like say if a child is on the autism spectrum, they may not want to play with another child, but they would still want to be in the same area. They want to play next to them, and so that's called parallel play. So even for our adults that are neurodivergent, they don't necessarily want to be in a room off by themselves. They want to be part of the group, but not right in it. So having your furniture set up in a way that it's more like they can be on the peripheral, they're still involved, but they're not right in the midst of it. So just arranging your furniture in a way that people can enjoy the library in different ways can go a long way. If you have the capacity to make verbal announcements, that's helpful in helping people transition from one event to another, or especially like if it's time to close, giving people that cue that the library is going to close, they need to start wrapping it up. That can all be very helpful. White noise devices sprinkled throughout your library, that can help somebody have that quiet space, but they don't have to go off by themselves somewhere. Sensory-friendly furniture. This can be simple as a rocking chair, a bean bag. So just thinking about different options, furniture that people can use in different ways could give them some sensory, help them regulate those things. If you can, scheduling sensory-friendly hours. So maybe people who do find the library to be overwhelming with the noise, the lights, what have you, having hours where those things are muted and there's not as many people there can be really helpful to your community. So the last part is just how do you build those community partnerships and build awareness? So, we understand about neurodiversity. We're going to do what we can to serve our patrons that are neurodiverse, but also what we can do as libraries is build awareness. There's still a lot of stigma around these things, and it makes people hesitant to ask for help or to ask for supports or to give feedback on how the library can help them. So, building awareness can be really helpful for your community. That's one thing we can do to help. And there's lots of people in your community that you can partner with. So there's your mental health providers. Those could be private. They could be county mental health providers. Vocational rehabilitation is helpful in terms of helping people find and keep a job. There's caregiver support groups. Peer advocacy groups are very important for our adult neurodiverse population. Social workers, if somebody's struggling with transportation, housing, food. School counselors are another source. Occupational therapists are somebody that you can talk to in terms of some of the sensory and motor skill issues that we've talked about. Speech therapist. And so some initiatives. I know we're running low on time, so I'm talking fast. But, these are some things that you can think about, is hosting a sensory-friendly library hours like we talked about, creating a social group, book club, something to bring people together, and you can use social stories. Curating a neurodiversity resource collection. That can be books, pamphlets, infographics. You can get free pamphlets from the National Institute of Mental Health. They'll pay for them, ship them, no charge for libraries. And collaborate, like I said, with occupational therapists to design inclusive materials and activities. Hosting talks. Develop a LibGuide with local resource information. Develop some kind of career prep partnership, either with VR, vocational rehabilitation, or your campus career services. You can offer neurodiverse friendly story time. So it just goes on and on. And so, during the programming, things you can do would be to provide fidgets, sensory seating, Carpet squares can help our younger children know what their areas are, their boundaries. Noise canceling headphones, transition cues. And then just allowing people to move if they need to, letting that be something people can get up and move around, and offering assistive technology. Whew. That's a lot. So these are just events you can celebrate at your library throughout the year. And I think that's everything. Okay, thank goodness. Okay, so that was a lot. But please tell me if there's any questions. I don't want to keep anybody long here, but I want to touch on everything. If there's any questions or comments, I'm happy to take that. Yes.
So I'm in our youth services department, and I run into challenges a lot during story time, where we do have those supportive tools and fidgets and things like that, but we have an added layer. We see a lot of caregivers and families that English is not their first language, and so on top of trying to support the child that might be having a hard time in story time and make sure that it's a safe environment for everyone.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that and then be able to communicate.
Right.
And I don't know if you know of any resources with language barriers on top of some of this stuff.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Very multi-layered thing that we deal with often.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Some of these families, there will be a big bad day.
Yeah.
I don't see them again. And it's not that we've said anything.
Yeah.
But I can tell that they can tell.
Right.
And then I don't see them again.
Yeah.
Either for a long time or just never see them again.
And of course, like we talked about, visuals are helpful, but that's only going to go so far in that situation. Is it possible, just to provide a little, some tips, written tips, but in other languages? And so, if my child's doing this, here's a space where you can go for a few minutes and come back, or here's a signal if you need help or you would like me to do X, Y, and Z, please do this, and so that way they just know what are their options other than just to get up and leave, So I guess it would be the same kind of tips you would want to convey, but just have that printed out and ready to go in another language, especially if they can gesture and signal if they need something.
We do the expectations at the beginning.
Yeah.
Of story time.
Yeah.
Good about that. And
yeah. And this might be more for the caregiver to know what do I do, what do they want me to do, so that could be helpful if possible.
You're right, the printing out and the written is probably better.
Yeah.
A chance to.
Yeah.
If you don't know all the languages we're dealing with.
Right.
When they pick up something, they have the time.
Yeah.
To read it and try and figure out what
it
says than just hearing.
And providing those options for them, what can I do, and then letting them is okay. If it is a bad day, please come back tomorrow. We'll keep dealing with it. We'll help you. Yeah. So, all right. Well, I appreciate your time. Thank you.